Why are there no white people in the Bible, or white Hebrews either? Many headlines, past and present, have wrestled with the color of pharaohs and Christ. As African Americans, whenever we find a hole in the myth that our origins began on slave ships run by white civilization, the term white expands. The Mediterranean, now white. North Africa, now white. Nile Valley, now white. Persian Empire, white. Then they have the nerve to turn around and critique the woman king or a black woman playing Queen Elizabeth. So today we won't be on an Afrocentric track, the term used to contrast the ubiquitous Eurocentric indoctrination we all receive. We will be using a subjective emphasis, which is how we all argue, by making different variables more important than others. For example, someone could say that you picked them up late and that ruined everything, and you could counter with the fact that you showed up to take them, and that's more important than them complaining and wasting time. The facts are not in dispute. One, you are late. And two, you actually showed up. So it's hard to say who's right when everyone agrees on the facts. I live in a country where who has a uterus is not a settled fact, if you ask one side. And on the other side, they can't admit who their president is. So while proving Jesus wasn't from Sweden and Egypt is in Africa shouldn't be too hard, I live in a time where mental gymnastics should be a sport in the Olympics. Let's start with race. It's by definition a social construct with no legitimate basis. I'll be using the US version of the one-drop rule and also the contemporary views of the times in question. My biracial children are whiter than any of the peoples I'll be referring to in antiquity, and their driver's license says black. Their mothers are French and Irish, or Frankish, Gaelic, and Celtic for the purpose of this video. And so next up, we'll go into the Jews who are white when they say so and not white when Whoopi says so. When it comes to Ye or Kyrie, it's black Hebrews, but we don't say white Jews or white Hebrews because white is considered the default, thanks to the Eurocentric indoctrination that we all receive. Are the European transplants that make up Israel or the Jewish diaspora not legitimate Jews? Well, since Judaism is a faith and they practice it, they are real Jews. When black people practice Judaism or Islam, we have to add black to denote this disingenuous imitation that we're doing. Christian Bale plays Moses, Russell Crowe plays Noah, and there are no complaints from the Jewish community. Viola Davis is attacked for complaining about audience turnout for a female-led historical African drama. And toxic fandom jumped on her head like they do for anyone without a MAGA hat. When Christian Bale and Ridley Scott literally blamed the audience and racism for a whitewashed cast. Toxic fandom supported them. Scott and Bale are right. The financiers, the studios, don't want to finance the truth, and a Eurocentric audience doesn't want to pay to see the truth. This may be a bit of a long preamble, but it's an important prologue because you can't follow the logic if you're coming from such a diametrically opposing view. This war continues against Wakanda with people just recoiling at the notion of an advanced African civilization. That shouldn't be a problem based on history, but when you're indoctrinated into a Eurocentric view, then you just can't understand the seemingly large leap in logic. Our methodology I've chosen to use, chronology, as the best weapon against flawed logic for matters such as these. I can't claim that Kenya started a moon colony in 1958 because Kenya wasn't a country yet, and no one would set foot on the moon for another decade. King Tut didn't fight a T-Rex. You see where I'm going with this? Some things can't be argued because they're considered impossible. The burden of proof shifts to those who wish to contradict you to prove that there were dinosaurs in Cairo or Kenya had a lunar colony in the 1950s. So, good luck. Now, terms to dispose of. Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, Far East, Southeast Asia, West Indies, etc. Eurocentric terms are void in this context because their purpose is to explain the world from that perspective. That's why Iceland isn't called the Middle West, Florida isn't the Middle South, and the UK isn't the Far West. Too many times people get confused by trying to shoehorn these generally racist terms into their understanding. But this is about the ancient world, not the antebellum South. So projecting blue eyes on everyone of substance and projecting black skin on every subjugated group is nonsensical. So try to resist the urge to turn all of history into Alabama in the 1850s. Chapter 1, page 1. We was kangs. This isn't as important to black people as it is to Jews and whites. So again, chronology. When the Egyptians, black, by the beaten in the street by the police and called nigger standards, yes, that would make them black. If they were alive today and driving around Cleveland, they'd be black. By the traditional, blacks should accept that American slavery saved them from savagery, and anyone who did anything in Africa before slavery was white, then no, of course they're not black. Because, of course, if anyone did anything, they must be white. The way my pale, light-eyed children are black and my dark-skinned Latin friends or Caribbean and African friends don't consider themselves black. The irony is me and my offspring are not black on skin tone, but because we have white ancestry. Like Latin folks come over as descendants of African slaves mixed with native peoples and maybe a drop of Spanish blood, and all of them imagine themselves as Queen Isabella herself. Africans aren't black because their blood and features are watered down by generations of rape by white slaveholders. So they don't consider themselves a defeated population the way African Americans are. So black will mean, for this purpose, black and brown skinned people indigenous to the area, and then white will mean white skinned people indigenous to an area. Egypt rests on the Nile Valley alongside its neighbors, the biblical Kush, which represents regions that ironically are known to be black, like Somalia and Sudan and Ethiopia. So for 2,300 years, this area flourished and produced one of the world's first and largest and definitely longest standing empires. This is only Africa along this river and the Red Sea. There's no Islam, no Christianity, no Roman Empire, no Greece, just a region of people darker than they are now. When they have bloated bellies with flies on their eyes or move from Somalia to Congress, you know that they're black. When they rule Egypt, they become Kate Moss. After 2,000 years, around 1070 BC, Egypt was in decline, and a few centuries later, Kashta, the king of Kush, was seasoning. Hopefully no one thinks Nubians or Ethiopians are white. Again, Kenyan moon colony. So there's no doubt that one, prior to any European incursion, these admittedly ancient black civilization rose and fell over multiple millennia. 8th century, 800 years before Christ, is a good time for this black king to attack its neighboring black kingdom of Egypt, because that's when Greece and Rome started to emerge. These two south of white people's empires would be the source of most of the misunderstandings, since they would later impose their civilizations onto the white western tribes of Europe. It's why Latin is the basis for most of its bastardized languages, like French and Spanish, why English explains every word is either Greek or Latin based, or of course, Germanic. The Western barbarian tribes weren't the civilizations and cultures. The conquest flowed in one direction. So yeah, we was kings, but y'all weren't Caesar or Alexander. So back to chronology. The Roman Empire went on for centuries, about 7 to be exact. Not in total, but so far, before Caesar waged the Gallic Wars and decided to tame the native white tribes of Europe. These barbaric tribes represent modern-day France, Germany, the UK, Scandinavia, etc. Everywhere people that are considered white are from. Again, the chronology. Egyptian empire is pretty much gone and had run out of gas by the time Alexander shows up. So Alexander, who also wasn't white, but played by an Irishman, Alexander despised wild red-haired barbarians. Sorry about that. So it's kind of ironic because Ireland is known for red hair and pale skin, and that is exactly the way Eastern Europeans describe the barbarians. So what an irony it is to have people play as their conquerors. I assure you, Denzel won't be playing General Robert E. Lee in a biopic. Aristotle contrasted the skin of those in the Mediterranean civilizations, i.e. south of white people, as ideal compared to the pale barbarians. So again, this is to make sure that you're not confused as to how they looked, because they are distinguishing themselves, oddly enough, almost on a racial hierarchy, that their skin tone is superior to the pale skin tone of their northern neighbors. As a side note, Jews, Italians, and other Mediterranean groups gained a white franchise in the 20th century. So most of them have been considered white here since 1930s and 40s. This world run by the pale barbarians considered their skin tone to be the best. So by the time Aristotle and Alexander got their Watt papers at Ellis Island, and could go ahead and start making pizzas, because now the tables have turned and the pale skins are the ones in charge. Alexander gets to Egypt in 332 BC and took over what was left nearly 400 years after the Ethiopian conquest in 750 BC. So all of Black Africa, the Red Sea civilizations, have culminated in 3,000 years of trade, technology, infrastructure, and is the home of monotheism, the first Christian nation. As for the impossibility of Black people being able to migrate from Cairo to Kinshasa in 3,000 years, that's about the distance from New York to Reno, so that's silly on its face. People made it from the Atlantic to the Pacific, but not from the Red Sea to the Atlantic. That's also supposing that modern Black people give a damn about ancient Egypt. Generally, the issue arises with the knee-jerk reaction by Eurocentric cultists depicting people who were clearly Black as white in movies and documentaries and things like that. So far, Black African Red Sea civilizations had a 2,300 year head start on Greece and Rome, which came in around the 8th century BC, and despised the white Western European populations. Aristotle, a big fan of slavery, wanted Alexander to enslave all of them. Caesar led a conquest to kill and subdue them in the 50s BC. All of the Old Testament has taken place, and not a single white person has set foot in the lands mentioned in the Bible. Neither Alexander or Aristotle saw any white Jews in Israel or anywhere else. In 48 AD, Claudius asked that conquered people, i.e. people that shouldn't play them in movies, white people, be admitted to the Senate. Eventually, foreigners would start to be allowed to participate in Roman affairs. But by now, Jesus is dead before white people can even use the bathroom in Rome. The entire Bible has taken place, and we can't get the white world into civilization yet. Chronology. Now we're up to the Council of Nicaea by Constantine. This officially marks the end of Christianity as a cult. In 337, Constantine adopts Christianity. Izana, the king of Axum, or Ethiopia, becomes the first Christian nation. This is important. I'll talk about Armenia in a minute, because this is not a missionary church. The first nation means a legitimate country at the time when white Europe is still considered barbaric tribes. Now, Armenia is a little bit controversial because it's based on the baptism of a leader, which they say could be off by a century or so, and also of whether it was a nation state or not. But either way, the debate is about whether this Black African country, because only Ethiopia is considered a nation, none of the white Western countries are considered a nation. You've heard the term barbarians at the gates. That's the day white people show up in Rome and the city is sacked. And that isn't until 410 AD. So the Bible is literally signed, sealed, and delivered prior to baptism of Clovis in 496 AD, and his campaign to rid white Europe of heretics over the next 5 centuries. So this is when white people will start to be more and more introduced to Christianity. Many wars and bloodsheds as white Europe held onto their gods and customs, but the church became the primary means of colonialism. White Europe will use those same tactics of swords and Bibles to take the New World. Meanwhile, Africa invades the Iberian coast and builds modern-day Spain and Portugal. It's an ironic mistake because the war to remove the blacks from Spain led to the funding of the expeditions to find the new routes to the Indies, and then, of course, history turns 180 degrees. The common phrase of Europe stops at the Pyrenees, or Africa stops at the Pyrenees, was a way for the French to say that the mountains prevented Africa from expanding into France. While the Moors could do what they wanted in Europe, there was no concern from major African empires that were bigger and stronger than the Moorish Empire, like Ghana, Songhai, and Mali, which was larger than Germany or UK, and had about 40 to 50 million people at the time, which makes it larger than most European populations and nearly that of the Roman size of the Roman Empire at its height. So you have Mali, 40 to 50 million people at its height. It can't be taken on by any European empire, or not empire, nations or tribes or kingdoms or fiefdoms, which is all they were at that time. So there was no incursion as the way you imagine it of these kings and these swords, medieval Europe, and just these people running around with spears. You try to fight Sunni Ali, you don't make it back to Europe. They've domesticated all the animals. They have the blacksmiths. They are not to be messed with. This is a empire on the west coast of Africa in medieval times that couldn't be beaten. This is probably where most of African Americans hail from. You want to put us on the west coast? I'll take Mali any day over Egypt. Now, they also produced the richest man to ever live in Mansa Musa, and his predecessor, Abu Bakr, attempted to cross the Atlantic 2 centuries before Columbus. Nobody in medieval Europe could have gone to war with Sunni Ali. Not Egypt, and so we're not really concerned with any of that. Ethiopia, the Greek word meaning blackface, which they use for everyone in Africa across the Mediterranean on the Red Sea, has spent centuries trading with everyone from Persia to China, not to mention the rest of Africa and civilized Europe. The Jews have seemingly reached white Europe around 321 AD. Later, because of the Christian doctrine against usury, they were asked to handle money lending, and thus begins the stereotype of world domination by money. 16 centuries later, these white Jews in white Europe are placed into Palestine, where many remain as a de facto state and a U.S. military and influence proxy. Chronology. So you can argue Kenyan lunar stations, or you can do what black people have done with ahistorical depictions of ancient African empires and Bible stories, which is shrug and move on with your life. I know your view of history is distorted, and it's not your fault. When Christianity came, they asked the locals to make murals and stained glass, and people pictured themselves in stories. Now these documentarians, modern day, know better and continue to use art from 5 or 6 centuries ago for stories that are 2,500 years old. You see an old picture about people who lived a long time ago, and you conflate the two things together. Of course, it's nonsense for Christ and the Roman emperor or pharaoh in antiquity to look Scandinavian, but how'd you know that? The art is shown like Jesus sat for a portrait. Chronology is why the empires of antiquity are black in the Red Sea world. Chronology says whether Jews who hadn't set foot in Europe yet look completely different than the other people in the region, especially knowing the contempt Greece and Rome had for pale-skinned barbarians. Chronology says between Moorish conquest to the Mali Empire covering nearly 500,000 square miles, who's worried about Egypt? Of course, I can go up and down the coast of Africa. There's ancient Nigeria, the King of Congo, Great Zimbabwe. I know your history. You don't know mine. So this is not a battle you have enough respect for your opponent to win. I don't believe the world was or will be better under black rule. And this journey took away the sense that white people had a monopoly on power. It turns out it's just their turn. And they're making the same strides and mistakes as everyone else before them. Chronology.